There we go.
Hey, Jeff, how's it going?
Good, good. How you doing?
Good, good. It's expected. Talk about IT is going to have tech difficulties, right? So,
Well,
uh,
you wouldn't believe it. It's like my machine was running a little sluggish, so I said, "Oh, let me do a quick reboot."
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
and of course, there was like patches that were pending. So I'm like,
there,
oh no.
there you go. There you go. We're talking about DevOps tonight. That's for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So, Jeff, I'm just gonna make communicate a few items to the audience, and then we can get started. Um, and I guess, Jeff, can you see my screen? And I guess everyone else can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Perfect. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining the session tonight. Jeff is going to talk about DevOps. Before we do, I just want to communicate some items. So this session tonight is sponsored by Manning Publications. If you go over to Manning, you can use the WeCloudData 39 discount coupon to get 39% off items at Manning. Really high quality books there, so check it out. We also have a WeCloudData DevOps program starting March 3rd, 2022. You can go to the website and I'll put these links in the chat later. So feel free to explore those avenues there. In terms of the talk tonight, so Jeff is Director of Production Operations at Basis Technologies. He's also the author of Operations Anti-Patterns DevOps Solutions. So going to be a really cool talk tonight from Jeff. And yeah, Jeff, I'll hand over the mic and the stage to you. So take it away.
All right. Can folks see my screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, awesome. All right, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about DevOps, but more importantly, I'm going to talk about how we go about implementing change, because at the heart of DevOps is really a change in how we do work. So I'm going to talk about people, process, tools, and specifically in that order. When you guys hear about DevOps, when people talk about DevOps, we talk a lot about all of the cool whiz-bangy technology, the Kubernetes, all of that fun stuff. But we're gonna look at things a little bit deeper here. But before we get started, I kind of wanted to level set on what we're talking about when we're talking about DevOps and sort of the history of it. And back when I got started in technology, there wasn't a lot of collaboration between the development teams and the ops teams, right? Someone, I don't remember who it was, but someone coined this term, the wall of confusion. And basically it was this invisible barrier between the devs and the ops teams in terms of what our goals were. Devs want change, right? They want to push out changes as quickly as possible because that's how they're measured. They're measured on features, they're measured on delivering code, whereas ops is measured on stability, right? And one of the enemies to stability is change. So when you set these two groups up in this dichotomy where their goals are opposed to one another, you create this friction. And that friction just sort of boiled over. And it created a lot of animosity between development teams and ops teams. And for a long time, we weren't really working together towards a common goal. Instead, we were worried about, blaming infrastructure for being too small, blaming developers for pushing code out without testing it properly. And everything was just a bit of a mess. So that's when the term DevOps started coming around, and we started saying, well, how do we make sure that development and operations are working together and that they're both sort of not only adopting practices of each other's teams, because ops can learn a lot from the way dev works and dev can learn a lot from the way ops works. But also, how do we go about facilitating better communication between those two groups, better collaboration? Because once we start Once we start collaborating, once we start working together more closely, we get better outcomes. When we start marching towards common goals, we get better outcomes. And that's really what is at the heart of DevOps. So I kind of wanted to level set with that so that we sort of knew what we were all talking about when we talk about this DevOps concept. So at the heart of all of this, right, is people, and emotions drive a lot of our decisions. It's not logical, but it doesn't make sense for us to ignore it, right? So for every decision you make, whether you know it or not, for everything that you're involved with, at the core of you is some emotion that you're experiencing. And not recognizing that emotion can sometimes lead us into a trap. And if you're trying to introduce change in your organization, like a DevOps transformation, not thinking about people's emotions and people's feelings and what people are, or how people are going to be receiving this change, can be detrimental to actually rolling out this sort of DevOps transformation. One of the things that we talk about is when change happens, it either can happen through you or it can happen to you. And what I mean by that is, it is very different if I, as a leader, come to you and say, Frank, we're going to start doing production deploys this way starting tomorrow. That's a change that's happening to you, right? You weren't involved. Someone's coming by and just basically changing the way you work, versus through you, where someone is working and collaborating with you and they say, Frank, we need a better way to deploy. Here are the problems that we're running into. How do we get there? If you approach it that way, you're much more likely to get buy-in, because you're getting people on board with this idea of what the goal is and trying to achieve that goal, leveraging their expertise, as opposed to sort of coming with a pre-baked plan and expecting everyone to just sort of buy in. So whenever you're implementing some sort of change like this, there's usually three components, right? There's people, process, and tools. The way you go about making that change and the order in which you approach it is very important. If you do tools, process, and then people, that becomes problematic, because why? You've picked a tool, right? Let's say you're going to do a continuous integration or continuous deployment, right? You're looking to do automated testing, and you're going to use Jenkins. You've decided that Jenkins is the tool you're going to use. Now that you've chosen the tool, you're going to identify the process, but now your process is constrained by the tool that you've chosen. And then you're going to try to get the people on board with that, right? But because you put the people last, they're going to be frustrated, right? They're going to be disinterested because they weren't involved in making that change and being an instrument in it. If you do tools, people, process, you end up running into similar problems, only now you've got the people on board, but you've already chosen the tool. So anyone that's been part of an organization where someone has chosen a tool for you that you're going to do, that's going to be instrumental in your job, that's a little frustrating, because you're like, well, why wasn't I involved in this? I'm going to be the person that's using it all the time. Why was I not involved in that decision process? Once you do that, your emotions kick in and you're instantly hostile to this, right? So there's no chance that you're really going to get the process right, because people are still frustrated by the fact that they weren't involved in the tools choice. And that pattern just sort of completes itself. The only way that it really works is if you go people, then process, then tools. You get people on board with whatever the vision is going to be, right? What it is that you're going to do. Then together with those people, you shape what the process is going to look like, right? How do we go about doing the thing that we're going to do? In the world of DevOps, maybe it's, okay, now that we've got the people on board with this automated deployment idea, for example, what does the process look like? Never mind the tool at this point. What are the things that we need to do in order to get a deployment working? And then after that, together you choose the tools, because now you've got the people on board with the goal. You've got a process defined. You know what it is that you need to accomplish. Now, choosing the tool is relatively simple, because you've defined all of the success criteria. The people are on board. You've defined the process. Life is good. Choosing a tool becomes a lot easier. So with all that, I'll introduce myself, although I've already been introduced. My name is Jeff Smith. I'm the Director of Production Operations at Basis Technologies. We just recently changed our name. So that's why some of this stuff says Centro. Previously, I was the Site Reliability Engineering Manager at Grubhub. And as mentioned, I wrote a book, Operations Anti-Patterns and DevOps Solutions. I've been in the operations field for, I hate to say it, but it's been over 20 years now. I started my career in ops. I'll probably end my career in ops. And it's been interesting watching this DevOps transformation sort of transform the way these teams work. And I'm really excited to get you guys sort of introduced to it and hear some of your perspectives on what life is like, because I think we're starting to enter this era where people are entering the field and DevOps is the only real model that they know or that they're familiar with. So super excited about that. So as we start talking about sort of implementing this DevOps transformation, right? Like, you're in an organization, you realize there's some dysfunction and you say, all right, I think if we can change the way these teams operate and interact with each other, that would be successful for the organization. But in order to do that, you have to create this shared vision of what it is that you're attempting to achieve. And this is really true, not just of a DevOps transformation, but really any project. Anytime you're trying to enact change, you have to make sure that everyone is on board with what it is that you're attempting to accomplish. So I'll give you a funny story that my manager told me. He said it was like a Russian folklore or something like that. So there's two prisoners working like a chain line, right? And there's a new supervisor on board. And prisoner one digs a hole. Prisoner two comes by, covers up the hole with the dirt that the man just dug. Then they move on down the line and he digs another hole and the second prisoner fills that hole back up. And the supervisor watches this for a while and he's new, so he's a little confused. So he goes up to them and he says, guys, what are you doing? What's going on? He's like, oh, I dig the hole, he fills the hole. And the supervisor's like, well, that doesn't make any sense. He's like, oh, well, the guy that plants the tree is out sick today. So these guys are busy doing their job, right? But not giving any thought to what it is that they're trying to accomplish. So instead, you know what I mean? When the middle guy is out, that step just doesn't happen, but people continue on doing their job. But it leaves zero actual attainment of the goal of what it is that they're trying to accomplish. Everyone's just sort of focused on doing their particular task. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about understanding the vision, right? Because it has to go beyond just doing your job. You have to understand what it is that the organization, whether it be your team, your department, your company as a whole, what it is that the organization is trying to accomplish, and ensure that every team member knows the overall strategy, right? Beyond their individual area of responsibility. They have to know, what is it that we're trying to do? What is it that all of the different team members and how they contribute to that? Because that is the way that I can assist them moving forward. Because sometimes you have to optimize for the whole. And the problem with that is sometimes that means your job gets a little more difficult because it's easier to put that burden on you. And I'll give you an example. This happens in ops all the time with cloud technology. Let's say we've got an application that's running in production and we discover that it's got a memory leak in it, okay? The memory leak, will eventually consume the box in 3 weeks' time, but we deploy every 2 weeks, so it's not usually a problem. We can either spend countless hours of development time trying to trace down this memory leak, or we can have ops just deliver a bigger box. Does that solve the problem? No, but it kicks it down the can long enough to where we can still get some of our higher priority things out. Is that a perfect solution for me in ops? No, not at all. But if I know that we're rushing to get a particular feature out so that we can close a huge deal to meet our corporate strategy or our corporate goals, that's a burden that I'm willing to carry, even though it's not great for my team, it's great for the organization as a whole. And it's a better use of development time for them to be able to focus on delivering those features. And for me, yes, I've got to eat crow a little bit, but it's not the end of the world. The team, the organization is still successful. So by understanding the vision and the strategy, right, like that allows me to make that decision and offer that solution. Whereas if I didn't understand the overall goals of the organization, who knows? I might have said, no, there's no way we're going to do this. You have to commit developer time for this. And then we end up not getting that particular account. So again, like I said, optimizing for the whole. But the catch is, when you're optimizing for the whole, someone sort of needs to look out for the whole as well. There needs to be someone that understands the process sort of from beginning to end. In a lot of organizations, that's the product team. But in some organizations, that doesn't even exist. There isn't anyone that actually knows it from beginning to end. And that's a place where people on any side of the technology spectrum can add a lot of value to the org, right? Just knowing the high level process flow of your application or your service or whatever it is you're delivering. That is something that, people often look for when they're looking to differentiate themselves in an organization, is to understand beyond their scope of responsibility. But typically, that's something that product owns. And like I said, sometimes a team takes on an extra burden to ensure, that optimization is good for the organization as a whole. Another big thing when we talk about these sorts of like DevOps transformations and really, styles of working, is prioritization. And priorities are weird because no one really has a clear definition of what priorities are. Like everyone has like a slightly different take on that. For me, I don't believe in multiple priorities. You have a priority, right? So if you're giving a presentation to your boss and it's a super big, important presentation, and then someone comes in and says, hey, your spouse has been in a terrible car accident and they're on their way to the hospital. Do you have two priorities? No, you've got two things that are very important, but you've got one priority, right? And that becomes your spouse. But because we have these different definitions of priorities, things get muddy. And when priorities aren't clear across teams, planning can get messy because we have a lot of times where teams need to interact with each other, right? Where dev is dependent on something from ops, for example. Like I want to launch a new service, but ops needs to build the infrastructure prior to that. So where is the launching of my service in the ops priority list? And to sort of illustrate this, here's an example. Let's say you've got 4 teams, okay? Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta. And then you've got 4 different priority classes, P1, P2, P3, and P4, with P1 being the highest and P4 being the lowest. So we've got 4 projects, project A, B, C, and D, and all 4 teams are working on those projects. I know it's a little messy, but just bear with me. So if my priority for the Alpha team, P1, is the A project, and I have a dependency on the Bravo team, right? Or let's say the Charlie team, right? I have a dependency on the Charlie team. For the Charlie team, it's really their second priority, not their first priority. So if I need to move it forward, how do I get my work that Charlie needs to do higher in their priority list? Or even worse, what if Alpha team is dependent on the Delta team and the A project is a P4 for them, but a P1 for you? That's why it's important to make sure that we understand what it is the organization is doing and how we need to reflect that in our list of priorities. Priorities are your defense for saying no to things, okay? So this is something that can be difficult, especially for people new to the field, where you have to be explicit about asking your manager what your priorities are, because that allows you to be responsible and respondent to the people that you're working with. So it's important that we understand what our priorities are, not just as a team, but as an individual, so that when we need to collaborate with these other teams, when dev and ops need to work together, I can appropriately slot those requests in a timely fashion. Because in order for dev and ops to work effectively together, when you give a commitment, you need to be able to deliver on that commitment. Another important thing that we talk about in these DevOps transformations is this idea of like these shared metrics of success. So when we talked earlier, we were mentioning how ops and dev were sort of focused on different things. Ops wants stability, dev wants change, and those two are in diametrical opposition to each other. An author that I love, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, said, bureaucracy is a construction by which a person is conveniently separated from the consequences of his or her actions. And what he means by that is like, if someone can make a decision, but not have to face the consequences of that decision, then you get chaos, right? You get bureaucracy, you get people dragging their feet on particular decisions. That's what happens when a developer can implement a bunch of changes, but then has absolutely no skin in the game as it relates to the stability of the application, because that was always on ops. So it's like, hey, I just pushed 500 changes, no big deal. The system went down, ops is up in the middle of the night solving it. That's the sort of disconnect that we're talking about. Same thing with ops, right? If ops is the one that can control when deployments go out and which deployments go out, he's got no skin in that ops person has no skin in the game when development can't deliver their features in a timely fashion because they've been told they're not allowed to deploy. One of the things we always talk about is like the phase 2 decision making, right? So let's say now that we're going to put skin in the game, right? We're going to say, all right, we're going to make sure that development has some responsibility in this world around deploying things, right? Around the stability of the application. Now that the developer is involved with this, they have a trade-off decision to make, right? Do they spend an extra 4 weeks or so making the service more reliable but missing their deadline? Or do they accept the current reliability to meet their deadline and promise to correct it later, right? That's that phase 2 decision. But if they've got skin in the game, if they're part of, let's say the on-call process, for example, then suddenly their motivation is different. Suddenly correcting the problem later actually happens, because if they're involved in the on-call process and they're being woken up at night because they're now on the hook for stability as well, suddenly they have different motivations and they're much more interested in getting these things fixed. But at the same time, they could also make the decision to say, well, now that I know that I'm going to be called, maybe I don't want to push this thing out. Maybe I will take the extra 4 weeks and make this more reliable. So that's an important concept of like making sure that people that are involved in the solution have skin in the game so that people are working towards this sort of common good. So when we talk about like sharing metrics of success, we ask ourselves like, does the person responsible have complete control over the metric, right? So if our metric is stability for the ops person, am I actually empowered to deliver on the stability metric? In most worlds, no, they're not, because they're not the one that's making code changes, right? They're not involved in terms of approving pull requests for code changes. So it seems unfair to measure them by that metric alone. Same thing for the developer. If the developer needs to deliver features, but has to go through this gate of the ops folks, is it fair to measure them solely on that without bringing in ops as well? So it becomes important to make sure that we start sharing some of these goals. So now if I'm an ops person and I'm also being measured by the number of features that go out, I'm much more motivated to help development deploy as frequently as they need to. That motivates me to automate deployments, right? So that I can give them the power to do deployments on their own. If development is measured on stability, right, that gives the developer the motivation to say, okay, I need to make sure this code is rock solid, because if I deploy it and it goes down, that is also on me. It's not just an ops. It's not just an ops concern. So those sorts of shared metrics that you can create in a team. And again, we're talking about DevOps, but really this can apply to, any sort of team collaboration, making sure that we have these shared metrics of success. So common scenarios that you see in tech when we talk about these shared metrics or these sort of skin in the game things are developers are not on call for the services they support, which means, I'm pushing out changes, and no matter what, I'm not going to be woken up in the middle of the night. That's going to be ops. That's a misalignment. Support staff are not consulted in technology choices, right? So someone decides that, hey, this new service that we're going to launch is going to run cockroach DB. So then they deploy it into production, and suddenly ops is on the hook for cockroach DB, and they have absolutely no experience with cockroach DB. But by the time it gets to them, it's too late, and they can't change away from that, right? There's been too much development on it. Groups that prioritize development work are not responsible for reliability. We've talked about that a lot. And developers are responsible for troubleshooting, but don't get the access they need. That's a common scenario that you see in a lot of older shops, where development is supposed to be able to help and be responsible for troubleshooting these production problems, but then they have zero access to production. They can't, they don't have access to logs, they don't have access to metrics. Things are behind, like this operational shield, and it becomes extremely problematic. I want to talk about process when we talk about people, process, and tools, right? So we've talked about the people quite a bit, getting them on board. But now we're going to talk about a little bit about the process. And when people hear process, a lot of times they sort of like have a knee-jerk reaction as like process is this big, heavy thing, right? That is something that big companies do and it's burdensome. But here's the deal. What you need to recognize is that a process is nothing more than a series of actions or steps taken in order to achieve a particular end, right? No matter what you do, you're following a process of some sort. Now, the question is the process an ad hoc process, right? Is it something that's sort of just made up as you go along? Or is it a process that's been defined and can be repeated? But either way, you're going through some sort of process. So I want folks to sort of eliminate this knee-jerk reaction that we have to the term process, and start thinking about it more from the perspective of, I'm taking a series of steps to achieve a goal. So when we talk about process, we have this idea of like an ad hoc process, right? That's where something is not defined clearly, right? So for example, we need to get code from development to production. You may not have a super tight, ironed out process for that, right? But you're still getting code to production. So that means you have what I call an ad hoc process. So here we're going to look at 3 different teams. And those 3 different teams are going to do things 3 different ways. Team Alpha is basically going to develop their changes. They're going to commit those changes. They're going to submit a PR. If the PR is approved, they'll execute unit testing. If the unit testing passes, then they deploy to production. Simple enough. Team Bravo is going to do something slightly different. They're going to develop their changes. They're going to commit their changes. Then they're going to do unit testing. After the unit testing is successful and passed, right, then they'll deploy to production. But they're not doing any PR. They're not doing any pull requests. They're just doing unit testing. If it passes, they're deploying to production. Team Charlie is going to do unit testing. If it passes, then it goes through a PR process. If the PR process is approved, then it gets deployed to staging. If the staging regression testing passes, then they deploy to production. All 3 of these teams start with developing changes and end with deploys to production. But the process that they take to get there is slightly different. And where that becomes difficult is predictability. One of the key tenets in DevOps, and really going to be in everything moving forward, right? The 21st century is going to be all about automation. But automation is empowered through predictability. Our ability to sort of expect what's going to happen. but predictability requires some sort of structured process versus an ad hoc process. So for example, going back to this, right? I can't make assumptions about what this code has gone through because it will depend on what team did it, right? So I can't even make the guarantee that all code goes through PR, pull request process, because Team Bravo doesn't do pull requests. I can't guarantee that all of the code goes through staging and is part of the regression test, because only Charlie is deploying to staging. Bravo and Alpha have a process that goes straight to production and bypasses staging. So this sort of like ad hoc nature eliminates the predictability for us to make assumptions about the process that a particular change has gone through. And to sort of highlight that a little bit more, I'll use the bar as an example. When you go out to a bar, right? Back when you could go out to bars, felt like 10 years ago now, you would often have two different types of bars, right? You would have the bar where there's a line around the corner and there's a guy at the door checking IDs, right? Once he checks your ID and he confirms that you're of age and you can enter the bar, you go in the bar. But guess what? Now everyone inside the bar can make the assumption that you're 21 or older, or I should say your legal drinking age. So now when you go to the bar, you just order and the bartender can assume, well, they're inside, which means they must be of drinking age because the process requires that the doorman check their ID, confirm they're of drinking age and lets them in. The other option would be they just let people in, and then every time you go to the bar, you have to prove that you're of drinking age. Why? Well, because there was no doorman, so the bartender can't make the assumption about your age any longer. So he has to verify at every stage to make sure that you're of legal drinking age. So that's what I mean about like optimizing for automation and predictability, right? Like being able to make specific assumptions based on the process that you know that folks have gone through. I don't know how many of you guys follow football, but you know, this picture is a perfect example, right? This is predictability. Dak is handing off to Zeke. Zeke knows he's getting the handoff, so he's already opened up his chest to receive the football from his quarterback, right? That's the sort of predictability that makes that handoff smooth. So that's just like another example, and I'm sort of a football fan, so I threw that in there. But making decisions based on well-established expectations makes automation and predictability a lot easier. So peer review serves as an implicit approval process, right? And I'm going to repeat that again. Peer review serves as an implicit approval process. And what I mean by that is when you go through a pull request process, you are asking someone else to look at it and say that this thing is okay. And that's important because later on down the road, and this may be a management concern depending on where you're at, but later on down the road, that PR allows you to establish like, yes, not only does this go through our process, but I can confirm that someone reviewed and agreed with the change that was taking place. And that approval can be used for things like audits, right? Can be used for things like ensuring peer reviews are happening, because that's essentially what it is. But it can also, you know, just be like, yes, this is how we do approvals. So because this change was peer reviewed, we know that it was okay to go to production, because if not, it would have died at the peer review process. So it allows us to skip a lot of the sort of old school change control processes that we used to do, where a bunch of people that know nothing about the change sit around and approve or disapprove changes that are going to production. Rehearsal deployments in lower environments, exercise expectations, right? That's that predictability piece. So if we get some code and we deploy it to a staging environment, that gives us an opportunity to learn how the thing is going to behave so that we can predict its behavior in production. That's why it's very important that we, you know, run code through lower environments to get a sense of how it might perform in production. We'll talk about how much we can trust that a little bit later. And it allows us to make assumptions about the environment, right? So if you're doing a bunch of changes on your local machine, the world gets a little different when you deploy it off your local machine and into an integration environment or a staging environment. So building that process allows you to also then start to build the predictability you'll need to understand how things are going to behave in production. Processes also help with quantitative data, right? Because now we understand that everything is going through the same process. So now we can measure our process and track it and put particular metrics around it. All right. Failures can be tracked down and the process improved, right? So if we know that everything is failing, we have a bunch of failures in step 6, whatever step 6 is, we can build metrics around that, we can track it, and then we can make changes. But if everyone's step 6 is a little different, that really doesn't give us the information that we need in order to make the appropriate adjustments. Not to mention, there's a diminishing return on the investment, right? Because if everyone's following the same process, if I fix step 6 for team A, I fix step 6 for team A, B, C, and D if they're all following the same process. So we all get to benefit from this sort of focus on a standardized process. Again, since the process is predictable, we can use automation to test for particular failures, right? So the common example scenario that you see is we take our code, we package it, we deploy it to staging, and then we run a series of automated regression tests on it, right? So now as a developer, even if I don't know what scenarios I should be testing for, I'm leveraging the automation that has been built up over time. And as long as I follow this process, I'm in good shape to leverage that. So predictability is also a key ingredient for reliability as part of the whole DevOps mantra, right? So one of the things we talk about DevOps a lot is reliability. Site reliability engineering is becoming big, but being able to predict behavior is important to be able to architect appropriately for reliable systems. So how do you gauge predictability prior to going to production? Are there production-like environments, and how are you validating against factors like volume? Because here's something that we talk a lot about when we're in staging and we're doing things in staging environments. You have to remember that staging is missing one key thing that makes it completely different from production, and that's users, right? Users change the game for everything. So staging is great for dry runs, but we have to understand like the limitations of that. But even understanding those limitations, it still gives us a tremendous advantage to be able to run through the deployment process, for example, without risking the production workload. Just seeing how it behaves on production size hardware, things like that. But we still have to understand the limits of that staging environment. There are no free lunches in any of this though, right? So process means there's less freedom in certain areas, right? So if you need to follow a process, chances are there's going to be a time where you want to do something that's slightly different and you can't do that. Why? Because it breaks from the process. So that's one of the downsides of it. The benefits definitely outweigh the costs though, right? So you will get more out of following the process than you will building your own road. And you can get freedom through other means, right? There are other ways in which, even though you're following a process, because you're following that process, we can now give you more freedom because we know the direction that you're going in. So I'll give you an example, right? One of the ways that we give access to developers in production is through our chat bot, right? So we have a bot that's listening in Slack, and he has hundreds of commands that he can execute on behalf of developers. But because we know that developers have sort of built their services and followed a particular path, we can build these commands so that we know that they're safe, so that if someone executes them, we know that they won't put the system at risk because we have a firm understanding of what it is they're trying to accomplish and how that's going to be implemented, which is very different than giving them access to an SSH terminal and saying, yeah, do whatever you need, you've got access. We've stripped down to a number of commands that they need. They've built their services to accommodate that. And now they get, the capability to do this where they may not have that freedom otherwise. So by following the process, they've actually gained more freedom, not less. All right, choosing tools. I'm going to speed up because I want to make sure we've got time for questions and things like that. There are a lot of tools out there, tons of tools. As exciting as the tool technology piece is, it is really the easiest part of all this, because people are hard. And then building the process with people is a little easier. And then the tools are pretty cake. Again, people should collaborate to define what that process is. And then the tools are chosen based on the defined process requirements, right? If the process is well defined, then understanding your must-haves versus your nice-to-haves is much easier. And that's really at the heart of tools, because you've got a handful of things that your tool must absolutely do, right? And that's going to eliminate a good chunk of the options out there. After that, everything else is just sort of window dressing. And I got to tell you, every tool sucks the more you get to know it, right? So one of the things I say is, I judge someone's expertise on technology based on how much they hate it, right? Because the deeper you get into technology, the more awful you realize things are. And you're like, oh man, this thing is sort of terrible underneath the hood, right? Once you've got through all the abstractions and all of that, you quickly realize, most of us don't really know what we're doing. So, there becomes this point of diminishing return. So it's important to understand what your must-haves are and your nice-to-haves, because then after that, all of the window dressing stuff really doesn't become super important. It's like, okay, cool, that's useful. We might be able to leverage that. But if you've got your process defined and your people on board, then hitting the 70% use case is really where things get, where the value gets at. Then after that, honestly, if there's 4 tools left, choose any of the 4. It doesn't matter. You'll in 5 years hate that choice and want to switch to another tool anyways. Just seems to be the nature of technology. So it's important to talk to your peers. Don't be afraid of process and structure. Go out there, chat with folks, understand what it is they're working on, understand what it is, how their stuff rolls in to the bigger picture. So quick recap: people, process, tools. When it comes to this DevOps transformation stuff, it's not just about the technology. It's about getting people on board. It's about talking to people. It's about defining processes. And then from there, choosing tools is key. Create shared metrics amongst yourselves, right? If your manager is not doing it, maybe you can suggest it, right? How do you bring the metrics of the teams that you operate into your own success criteria so that you're incentivized to optimize for the whole? And then make sure you understand the goals. Everyone should understand the goals. If you don't understand the goals, ask your manager, ask your manager's manager, ask your colleagues' managers. Understand what it is that the group is trying to accomplish so that you can help the team be successful. Decision makers should never be divorced from the consequences. If someone has the authority to make a decision, they should have skin in the game in terms of the impact of that decision. Process beats predictability. Predictability allows for freedom, and predictability is an incredible ingredient for reliability. I was running a little bit late, so I blew through the last part, but hopefully we got all that. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. Some contact info there. I'll also share that out with the WeCloudData folks so they can share it with you. I'm on Twitter, not as much as I usually am, but still catch me there. I also have a website, Attainable DevOps, in case we don't get the questions completely today. But there's other ways to reach out to me. So thanks a lot for having me. And I will turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Jeff. Really appreciate the talk.